Have you ever wondered if someone, somewhere, has been watching over you quietly, even when the world moved on? I want to tell you a story, not the kind you read in books, but the kind you feel in your bones, the kind that lingers in your soul. Years ago, I met a man named Thomas. He was 68, soft-spoken, with eyes that looked like they had seen 100 winters. He told me something I've never forgotten. He said, "There are chapters in my life no one ever read, pain I never voiced, moments of kindness no one noticed. But I have to believe someone recorded it all." And maybe you've felt that way too. Maybe you've done your best quietly, showing up, loving deeply, forgiving more than you should have, and yet no one seemed to see. But what if I told you heaven did? There is a scroll, a document, a divine record, and your name is written on it, not just scribbled in the margins, but inscribed with purpose. You are not invisible. You were chosen to carry a story heaven never intended to keep secret. And if you're still here, watching this, breathing, hoping, it's because the next page of your scroll hasn't been written yet. And it's waiting for you to pick up the pen of faith. So let's walk into this together. Because what's written about you above is far more powerful than anything you've lost below. I once met a woman named Eleanor. She was in her 70s, lived alone in a quiet house filled with old photo frames and the scent of lavender. She had spent most of her life caring for others, her children, her husband, her aging parents. But now, with everyone gone or grown, she confessed something that caught me off guard. "I don't think I matter anymore," she whispered. It wasn't self-pity. It was the quiet ache of someone who had given so much that she forgot her own worth. But what if I told you your name wasn't forgotten, it was reserved? You see, in the eyes of the world, we often measure value by noise, by recognition, by the number of people who still need us. But heaven operates on a different scale. While others may overlook you, heaven never has. Your name wasn't missed, it was held, protected, preserved for a moment like this. There's a difference between being overlooked and being set apart. Eleanor didn't know it then, but she was still carrying something sacred. Her presence, her prayers, her kindness, they had been echoing in places she couldn't see. And maybe that's true for you too. The world may have stopped asking for your opinion. The phone might not ring like it used to, but in heaven's book, your name is not just a memory. It's a mission. You're not past your purpose. You're standing on the edge of it, because the one who wrote your name into the scroll hasn't put the pen down yet. And in the next part, I want to introduce you to someone who's been watching over that scroll this whole time. Someone who has never once turned away. There's someone I want you to meet, not with your eyes, but with your heart. His name is Michael. You may have heard of him as the Archangel, the warrior of heaven, the one who leads armies of light. But behind the title, there is something deeply personal about him, especially for those who feel forgotten, wary, or left behind. Michael isn't just a figure in ancient stories. He's a guardian, and more importantly, he's your guardian. Think of him as the one who stands at the threshold between what's attacking you and what's meant for you. He doesn't sleep. He doesn't get distracted. He has one mission: to defend what's been written with your name on it. I remember hearing a story of a man named Joseph who was going through the worst season of his life. Financial loss, sickness, betrayal from someone he trusted. He told me, "Every night, I felt like something was trying to break me. But strangely, I also felt like something was holding me up. And that something was someone." Michael's presence doesn't always come with thunder or lightning. Sometimes, it's simply the strength to get out of bed, the sudden peace in a moment that should have shattered you, the unexplained courage to keep going when everything says you should give up. That's him. That's what he does. You might not see him. You might not hear his wings. But if you're still here, still standing after all you've been through, it's because heaven assigned a warrior to your name and the scroll bearing your story. Michael has been guarding it because there's something inside it, something ahead that darkness wants to stop. But Michael won't allow that. And in the next part, we'll talk about why heaven watches you more closely when the world forgets you. There's something tender and at times painful about being unnoticed. Maybe you've experienced it too. You walk into a room and no one looks up. You give your best advice and no one listens. You celebrate someone else's joy, but when your heart is breaking, no one seems to notice. It's a quiet ache, and it can make you wonder, do I even matter anymore? But here's the truth. When the world stops watching, heaven starts paying closer attention. I once sat with a man named Harold. He was 74, recently widowed, and had spent most of his life working with his hands, building homes, fixing broken things, helping neighbors without asking for anything in return. But when he lost his wife, he said something that stayed with me. "I feel like my chapter has ended, like I've been shelved." But I gently reminded him, what if the world shelved you, but God bookmarked your page? You see, heaven doesn't forget. In fact, God tends to draw closer when others step back. He leans in when no one else does. That's why so many moments that felt like endings were really beginnings in disguise. Just because people stop asking for your story doesn't mean your story is finished. Harold didn't know that just a few months later, he'd be mentoring young men at his church, guys who had never known a steady father figure. His quiet wisdom, once overlooked, became a lifeline for someone else's future. So if you've felt invisible lately, I want you to hear this. Your life is still being read, still being watched, still deeply valued. And that document in heaven with your name, it's not collecting dust. It's being studied with care, because what's written in it still has power. And in the next part, we'll talk about how even your tears have been recorded, one by one. Have you ever cried in silence? Those kinds of tears that no one sees, the ones that fall when the lights are off and everyone else has gone to sleep. We often think our pain disappears into the air, unnoticed and unmarked. But in heaven's record, every tear is ink. Every H you've felt is carefully written into the scroll bearing your name. There's a passage I love. It says God collects our tears in a bottle, not a metaphorical idea, an actual image of every drop being seen, saved, remembered. Let me tell you about Maria. She was 66 when her husband passed away. They had been married for over 40 years. For months, she couldn't find the strength to go back to church or even smile at neighbors. She told me once, at night, I would cry so quietly. I was afraid even God wouldn't hear. But what she didn't know, what I believe with all my heart, is that every single one of those tears was seen, and they weren't wasted. They were forming a testimony, because something changed. Not overnight, but steadily. Peace started arriving in small doses. A sense of warmth when she thought she'd forgotten how to feel. And then, one day, she started writing letters to other widows. Just handwritten notes of encouragement. Dozens of them. She never expected anything in return. But those tears she once cried, they had been transformed into ink that now helped write healing into other people's lives. That's how heaven works. It doesn't throw away your sorrow, it repurposes it. So if you've been wondering whether anyone noticed your heartbreak, your silent breakdowns, your quiet bravery, let me assure you heaven noticed. And in that scroll with your name, your pain has not been ignored. It's been woven into the fabric of a much bigger story, one where even the hardest seasons carry hidden seeds. And in the next part, we'll talk about what tries to stop you from ever discovering that story, and how to silence it before it succeeds. There's a quiet battle that happens inside us, not with fists or loud arguments, but with thoughts. Thoughts that whisper things like, "You're too late," or "You missed your chance," or worst of all, "You're no longer needed." Those aren't just passing feelings, they're strategies. You see, there's a reason you feel resistance when you start to hope again, when you try to pray again, when you dare to believe that maybe, just maybe, God still has something beautiful ahead for you, because there's an enemy who doesn't fear your age, but he does fear your awakening. I remember speaking with a man named Raymond. He had battled addiction for decades, lost connection with his kids, and by the time he was 60, he believed it was too late to rebuild anything. "The damage is done," he said. "What good would faith do me now?" But that voice wasn't truth. It was sabotage. The enemy doesn't need to destroy your life to stop your legacy. He just needs to convince you to quit. But something changed for Raymond. One morning, he read a verse that said, "I will restore to you the years the locusts have eaten." And for the first time in years, he believed that maybe not everything was lost. Today, he runs a small recovery group for older men who thought they were too far gone. Turns out, the one thing the enemy tried to silence, his testimony, became the very weapon that helped others find freedom. So let me tell you, those voices that shame you, that replay your regrets, that try to make you feel small and useless, they are not yours to carry. They are not from God, and they don't belong in your story. Because the truth is, if you've still got breath, you've still got a page to write. And the scroll with your name, it's not marked cancelled. Its marked continues. And in the next part, we'll talk about what that continuation really means and why your endurance is the seal that heaven honors. Sometimes we look back on our lives and wonder, how did I make it through that? The truth is, you've survived things that tried to break you, not because you were the strongest, but because you were chosen to endure. Endurance isn't flashy. It doesn't get applause. It looks like showing up on the days you wanted to give up. It looks like taking one more breath when your heart was heavy. It looks like keeping faith, even when the heavens were silent. That's not weakness. That's a seal of strength. I remember a woman named Carol. She battled a long illness, lost her husband during that time, and still managed to care for her disabled brother. She wasn't loud about her pain. She didn't post updates or ask for sympathy, but she carried on day after day. One afternoon, she told me, "I don't think I'm doing anything special. I'm just holding on." But what she didn't realize was this: in the kingdom of heaven, holding on is a declaration. It's a holy act, because the scroll with your name doesn't record perfection, it records perseverance. When the angels look at your story, they don't look for highlights. They look for the moments you stood firm in the storm, the moments your faith whispered yes when your world shouted no. That's what the enemy fears, not your strength, but your refusal to let go of hope. So if all you've done lately is keep breathing, keep believing, keep waking up, then heaven celebrates you, because the ones who endure are the ones who finish well. And that seal of endurance on your story, it's not just a badge of survival. It's a signal that something sacred is coming next. And in the next part, we'll talk about how heaven begins to send quiet signs, whispers, nudges, little confirmations that something written in your scroll is ready to unfold. Have you ever noticed something that felt too perfectly timed to be a coincidence? A number that keeps showing up. A song that plays at just the right moment. A phrase someone says that feels like it was meant just for you. These are what I call heavenly whispers. They're not loud. They're not dramatic, but they're real. And they often show up right before something sacred begins to unfold. Think of them as footnotes in the margin of your scroll. Little signs from heaven that say, keep reading, you're close. I remember a man named Samuel. After his retirement, he fell into a deep depression. He felt like he no longer had a purpose, no reason to get up in the morning. One day, while cleaning out his attic, he found an old journal he had kept in his 20s, filled with prayers, dreams, and hopes he had long forgotten. And on the last page, written in his own young handwriting, was a simple sentence: "One day, I will help others find their way back." He wept, not just because of the words, but because that same week, his church had started a support group for seniors dealing with loneliness, and someone had invited him to attend. Coincidence? I don't think so. He went, he shared his story, and he became a quiet anchor for others who had lost direction. You see, God doesn't always shout. Sometimes He simply nudges, sends a number, a memory, a journal, a person. And those little things, they're not random. They're reminders. So if you've been seeing subtle patterns, gentle signs, unexpected feelings that stir your heart, don't dismiss them. They might just be signals that your scroll is turning a new page. And in the next part, we'll talk about how to respond when that page starts to open, and why reclaiming what's yours is a holy act of courage. Sometimes, the most heartbreaking thing isn't what was taken from us, it's what we quietly walked away from. Dreams we stopped believing in, callings we thought we were too old for, joy we convinced ourselves we no longer deserved. But here's the truth. Much of what we've lost hasn't been stolen. It's been surrendered in exhaustion. And the good news, you can reclaim it. I once met a woman named Lillian. In her 50s, she felt a strong pull to write a devotional book for women going through grief. She started outlines, prayed over the idea, even shared it with friends. But then life got busy. Fear crept in. She told herself she wasn't qualified, wasn't spiritual enough, wasn't ready. So the calling sat, untouched, for years. Until one day, she heard a message that said, God doesn't change his mind just because you got tired. It struck something deep in her. That night, she pulled out her old notes. The words still stirred. The dream hadn't died, it had just waited. Within a year, she self-published that book, and it reached more people than she ever imagined. Here's what I've learned. The enemy doesn't need to destroy your future. He only needs to make you doubt it long enough to walk away. But God, he's not done. He doesn't toss aside the scroll just because you set it down for a while. It's still there, still open, still yours. So what have you set aside? A gift, a conversation, a prayer you stopped praying. This might be the moment heaven's gently saying, pick it back up, because when you reclaim what's rightfully yours, you're not being selfish, you're being faithful to the assignment your name is tied to. And in the next part, we'll talk about what happens when you say yes again, when you stop shrinking and start stepping into the reason you're still here. Saying yes again doesn't always feel easy, especially after disappointment. When you've tried before and things didn't work out. When you've prayed and waited and still felt silence. It's natural to protect your heart by staying small, quiet, hidden. But what if I told you that your yes, right now, matters more than ever, because your scroll hasn't been cancelled. It's been waiting for your permission to continue. I remember a man named Glenn. After a painful divorce in his 60s, he told himself his best years were behind him. He stopped volunteering at church, stopped calling old friends, stopped dreaming. I didn't want to risk hoping again, he said, but something shifted the day he agreed to help his neighbor's teenage grandson fix up an old car. It was supposed to be just a one-time thing, but that one afternoon turned into a weekly ritual. Over time, more boys started coming. They didn't just learn about engines. They learned about life, kindness, and quiet strength. Glenn said to me once, I thought I was done, but I realize now I was just paused. Your story might feel like it's slowed down, but that doesn't mean it's over. When you say yes, even a quiet trembling yes, you re-engage with what heaven still wants to unfold through you. And that yes ripples into the lives of others in ways you may never fully see. So if your heart is stirring, even just a little, that's not random. That's a sign. The scroll is opening again. And your yes is the pen that continues it. And in the next part, we'll talk about how to respond to this moment. Not just with words, but with something tangible, a simple act that honors your place in the bigger story. There's something powerful about putting pen to paper. In a world full of noise and distraction, writing something down feels like an anchor. It takes a passing thought and makes it real. And sometimes, the best way to respond to heaven's invitation is to write your answer. I once met a woman named Esther. She was 70, soft-spoken and thoughtful. One day, after watching a message about divine purpose, she sat down with a notebook and wrote one sentence. I may be older, but I am not done, she told me later. That sentence changed something. It was like I signed my name at the bottom of a new chapter. And that's exactly what this moment is, a chance for you to sign your name again. You don't need eloquent words. You don't need the perfect prayer. Just write what's true. Maybe it's I still believe, or I'm ready to hope again, or simply God, I'm listening. When you do that, it's more than a journal entry. It's a sacred agreement. A way of saying, I see what's written about me, and I'm not walking away. Because the scroll with your name on it isn't finished yet, and your response today becomes the ink of what comes next. So find a quiet space, a piece of paper, a note in your phone, and write something small but sincere. Because even that one act can shift everything. And in the final part, we'll talk about what it means to walk forward from here, not just inspired, but changed, with the quiet courage of someone who knows they've been named. There's a quiet confidence that comes when you know your name has been written, not just in family trees or forgotten records, but in something eternal, a scroll that holds your story, a document in heaven that still calls you forward. You don't have to chase worth anymore. You don't have to prove your value. It's already been declared. I think of a man named Walter. He spent much of his life believing he was just the background guy, never the leader, but never the one with the spotlight. But later in life, after years of quiet faithfulness, he began mentoring young men at his local church. One day, one of them said, "You don't talk much, but when you do, it's like heaven clears its throat." Walter smiled. He didn't need a platform. He had presence, and his presence carried weight, because he finally believed what heaven had always known to you. His story mattered, and so does yours. You are not here by accident, not watching this by chance. You've been called by name, and that name isn't fading. It's being carried by angels, remembered by God, and honored by time. So as you move forward, walk like someone who's been named. Let your steps carry the weight of that truth. Let your words reflect the grace you've received. Let your presence be a light in rooms that have grown dim, because the scroll isn't closed. The page is turning, and the next chapter, it begins with your next step.